of the United States may want to pull out of NATO. The New York Times reports the president discussed the move with advisors several times over the last year.
President Trump reportedly told his officials that he didn't see the point of the military alliance, which is, amongst other things, an important bulwark against Russia. So for more on this, we want to bring in CBS News State Department reporter Christina Ruffini. It's so good to have you here because often we've been talking to you while you are in Washington, D.C. So let's talk a little bit about this report. I mean, the president talking about these alliances, thinking that they're not of value, that's nothing new. Right. How concerning is this report, though?
Although he's never actually said anything about record,
right? That's
right. It's all about, and you know what? We knew about these reports before, right? Going into the summit last year, we had heard this, and everyone was a little nervous that he might get to Brussels and decide to pull out of the alliance because we kind of know how he feels about these group deals. Pulled out of the Iran deal, pulled out of the Paris Accord. He doesn't really like them, and he has a good track record. You know, he said in the campaign he didn't like these things, and for the most part, he's followed through with them. But when he got to NATO, he didn't end up saying that, and he gave a speech and said, you know, the allies had agreed to step up more and contribute more, and that was his big issue, so he was fine with it. I talked to a couple NATO member state representatives this week, and they didn't seem that concerned. They said the biggest thing when they talk to this administration is making sure that the Europeans are pulling their weight, right? Making sure they're getting up to that 2% GDP, because President Trump's big sticking point is that the U.S. is subsidizing the security of Europe. So they think as long as countries start contributing and really pulling their weight, that the U.S. will be fine and everything will be great.
And to his credit, countries have started to pay up a little bit more.
Indeed.
You know?
Right.
But Christina, remind our viewers what NATO stands for. I mean, this was an alliance that came about at the end of World War II as a bulwark, as you pointed out, against the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, and also as a way to include states into an alliance that would serve to perhaps not repeat the errors of the past, that it included 2 world wars and millions of lives lost. It is now expanded beyond the 12 original members. But where does it stand right now?
So this was, of course, part of that big international movement after World War II, the League of Nations, NATO, all these things where this international law for the first time became something that people thought, hey, we should get on this. This would be great. So it started with the 12 countries, but of course it's expanded now to 29. And its original purpose, the original Secretary General of NATO, who was a Brit, said my favorite quote, that NATO was meant to keep the Germans down, the Soviets out, and the U.S. in. So the Germans are up, the Soviets are Russians, and the U.S. is still in for now. But you know, the problem with these alliances, and we're kind of seeing this with the EU and Brexit, is the bigger they get, the more likely you are to have internal conflict. So as we've been talking about all week, there's this rift now between Turkey, which is a long-standing NATO ally. They joined in the 50s around the same time as Greece, and the U.S. over the Syria withdrawal and what to do about the Kurds. You know, the U.S. wants to make sure its Kurdish allies are protected on the battlefield, and Turkey considers a lot of those groups terrorists and said, you know, we're going to protect our national security. So that's all being worked out. But, you know, for the moment, the organization is together. The treaty still stands.
But what is sort of also interesting about how NATO has morphed over the last several decades is the inclusion of former states that made up the Soviet Union, which is what Vladimir Putin is most aghast at, which you have former satellites of the Soviet Union that have become since thriving democracies who are now part of the NATO alliance, and that Putin doesn't like.
These former Soviet blocs that, as you know, the Soviet Union withdrawal, were looking for security and ended up, you know, there was this battle. Are they going to go with Russia? Are they going to go towards NATO? And a lot of them decided to go towards NATO. So Putin, you know, at one point Russia was in this group called Partnership for Peace. So it was like NATO and Russia had this very official meetings and alliances, and they've withdrawn from that, especially after the invasion of Crimea. That's put a hold on it for now. So at one point through previous administrations in the early and mid-90s, there was even talk that Russia might join NATO. That's obviously so far from the case now, and Putin is not a huge fan of NATO.